Thank you for joining us here. One of the conversations that has come out of this is there are essentially these unregulated sites. You know, the El Paso shooter is believed to have used 8chan, which is a platform that is unregulated, in which it's essentially a breeding ground for white supremacy, for violence. Right now, there's not much federal oversight that we are aware of these sites. As president, what would you do? Would you call for greater monitoring of these sites? What would your plan be on that front?
Well, I would do what I've done as a United States Senator, which is call on also the social media companies to monitor and to shut this stuff down. There's a lot about also the business model of these sites that is about, you know, it's clickbait. The things that attract the most clicks make them the most money. It's part of their business model. And hate, sadly, happens to attract a lot of clicks. And so the responsibility is across the board, but including the social media companies. Any business model that profits off of hate is a business model that should be shut down.
Senator Harris,
I want to bring in the Rev here, but this... Yeah.
Senator Harris,
yes.
The president just came down from his helicopter, headed to the Air Force One to head back to Washington. Didn't say much. He did say hate has no place, but he didn't address directly what Vaughn just referred to, this manifesto or essay that really talked about white nationalism and talked about invasion of Mexico. He said, of Mexicans, rather, to this country. He said that he's going to speak to the nation sometime tomorrow morning around 10. Do you feel the president should address directly this whole question of white nationalism and this sentiment against Mexicans and other people of color, given his own statements of calling Mexicans rapists and all? Do you think he should directly address what is being clearly put as a motive for at least the shooter in El Paso?
Well, Rev, to the point of your question, he has addressed it over and over and over again. He has emboldened it. He has given it power. He has elevated it. He has coddled it. And he's got to stop. We have a president of the United States who has embraced white nationalism. Okay? And any words that he speaks today I find to be empty. And listen, I'm too busy watching what he's doing to hear what he's saying on this, too. Because the fact is that the clock is ticking. There are bodies still laying on the ground in blood. And it seems to me that he should be and have a sense of urgency about this and speak to the nation right now. So we know who he is. And, you know, frankly, this is one of the reasons I'm running to get him out of office, because the president of the United States has such power and responsibility, Rev, especially responsibility, to speak to our values and speak to our better selves. And what we have in this president is someone who always goes to the lowest point and always goes to the lowest common denominator. And then we see what takes place. People who profit in hate, who traffic hate, that hate which leads to lethal proportion, are being, you know, in many ways, their speech, their conduct, and their perspective elevated by this current president of the United States.
Now, if you were president today, right now, and you were dealing with Sunday evening, when over the weekend we've seen these kinds of mass shootings in 2 locations, what would you do differently than what President Trump is doing?
Well, first of all, I would speak to the nation about what we must agree is the core of who we are and what we are, and also what we are against. You know, we have to agree that whenever and wherever hate displays itself, we must all speak up and we must all speak out. We must also agree as a nation that whoever is the target of that hate, that they should never be made to fight alone. And those words need to be spoken by leaders. There needs to be an acknowledgement of the reality and the truth of the matter, which is that racism in our country is real, anti-Semitism is real, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, these issues are real in our country, and we must also speak truth about that even when it makes people uncomfortable. But we got to deal with this, because we are now seeing yet again, and I'm going to be graphic, we're seeing bodies on the ground in blood because of a failure to get all of this stuff under control. And it is not only about the white nationalism and the hate, it is also about gun violence and what we need to do to come to terms with the fact that we need reasonable gun safety laws in this country. But leaders need to lead. Leaders need to lead, because you know what? Folks are hurting right now. Folks are hurting and they're in pain. And it is obviously the families of those who have fallen and who have died. And it is their communities, and it is all of us who recognize this is just not evidence of a civil society, and we are better than this, and we can do better than this.